Hello and welcome back to the Renew You Students YouTube channel. We have been going through this series called The Tale of Two Kings, in which we saw how Israel, after essentially being ruled by judges and particularly having God being their ruler all over them, decided to ask for a king. And this was really an act of disobedience towards God, because God never wanted the people to have a king, but for the people to realize that he was the true king above them all. However, God still decided to allow them to have a king and show them what a king meant in the first place, and then bring a true king that would be able to follow the heart of God. And the first king was Saul, who seemed great at the beginning, but did not follow God and disobeyed him in multiple steps of his life. So once Saul showed his true colors, really, of disobedience, of not following God, God sought another person to be king. And this was David. And he was only a shepherd, the youngest of his brothers, and not really known by anyone, but God knew his heart, to the point is that knew that David was going to be a better king than Saul, and then David was anointed. And through different circumstances, we had David serving Saul, but in the last couple lessons, we found that the reign of King Saul came to an end in a very sad way because of his disobedience and not following God, where him and his children, and three of his children, died in battle against the Philistines. And when the moment came for David to be proclaimed king, since he had already been anointed and chosen by God, the people of Israel had split into two different factions, where one followed the last son of Saul, Ishbosheth, and the other ones followed David. And after several years of conflict between them, there came a moment in which there was going to be truce with David, where the general Abner was seeking to reunite Israel under David. But both Abner and Ishbosheth were killed. And David mourns for these people because he never actually wanted them dead and wanted really to reunite Israel in a different way. But now we have the story today in which David has now come to rule over Israel.
And so it's been a long journey up until this point. And so David had already been king of the southern end, which was called Judah. But now with the death of Abner and Ishbosheth, the people of Israel, which was the northern territory, they decided to reunite again with Judah. And so they were like, everybody across the whole territory was like, yes, David is our king. So both Israel and Judah came back together again. And David was anointed king over the entire land. And as kind of his first act of being king, the Philistines arose again. And they came after David and searched for him. And David had this great force that he had to try to defeat, and the Philistines were still very ruthless at this time. And so the first thing that David did was he went to God and asked God, should I attack the Philistines? Will you make sure that they are delivered into my hands? And God answered him and said, go. I will absolutely deliver the Philistines into your hand. So sure enough, David goes out into battle against the Philistines, and there was this great battle that happened, and David for sure was able to absolutely defeat the entire Philistine army, and because God was with him, and God honored him in that. And so it was kind of at this time that David not only got to unify Israel and Judah, but then got to fight for them and show them what he could be like as their king. And so it was a cool unifying moment for both Israel and Judah, now that they were all part of David's kingdom.
Yeah, and what the people of Israel and Judah didn't know about it is that this was something that David did all the time. Before he wanted to go into battle, before he wanted to do something, he continuously went to God and said, "Okay, what am I supposed to do in this circumstance? Guide me. Tell me what should I go? Should I not go? What is the way I'm supposed to do it?" And that is something that definitely applies to our own lives. We may not be King David, we're not kings, but we still, Tara and I, still consult God in each one of our steps in what we're going to do, because we see that this really showed who David was, but it also showed who God was, because he was God listened to David and gave him this direction that he needed to go. It's something that God wants to do in our own lives too. So not only in this story, but time after time, God is listening to the prayers of David and to our prayers and delivering the victory. So we see that David's campaign against the Philistines is just filled with success. And it's not because of the strength of Israel. It's not because of the strength of David, but it's because David knew who was the one who brought the victory. David knew who was the one that would make them successful, and that is God. So we will see now that as David becomes, the true king, he establishes a capital, he brings his people together. Now he has a lot more responsibilities about what to do also with the commandments that God had for his people. So now we're going to see, is David going to be able to step up to the plate, or will he start falling into the same disobedience that Saul had in his time as king?
So we'll see that in our next video here, in which David really has a choice to make about what to do with God among the people. And so we'll talk about that next time. We'll see ya.
See ya.